Welcome, everybody, to our summer of lectures focusing on the mythologies of the underworld. We've got an ambitious agenda to work with the stories that we have, moving all the way from its origins in the megalithic cultures, from the Neolithic period, from the island of Malta to the Orkneys, which is the subject of a separate series of presentations, and then up through the ancient world, all the way to postmodernism. So I'd like to begin with some introductory remarks having to do with the notion of the Nekyia, or the descent to the underworld, with some basic points of reference in terms of vocabulary and the orientation towards the subject, which I'd like to apply to our discussions of the specific examples, largely from the texts that I've asked you all to read related to the material. So I'm going to begin that with this introductory lecture by sharing my screen with you. And as always, the best practice is for you to record any questions or comments, observations that you might have, so that we can reconvene and have some direct face-to-face conversation about the material that I'm going to present in more in the way of a normal residential classroom. So we begin our descent to the underworld, or journey to the other world, however you might want to put it. And the first session will focus on the mythologies of the Mesopotamian region. But to begin, I want to provide a general overview and introduction to the subject, which I first became involved in essentially when I took this marvelous trip with Joseph Campbell, who you'll see sitting there. You'll see to my left, and we are on a little boat crossing over the Nile from Luxor to explore the valleys of the kings and the various tombs there, and with a specific relationship to the mythologies of the Near and Middle East, having to do with the otherworldly journey, for which, of course, the Egyptians are very well known. I had a wonderful conversation with Joseph Campbell on the crossing of this passage, and I've devoted a separate presentation on that subject of a memoir devoted to Joseph Campbell and the trips that I took with him in the mid to late 1970s. Many of you are aware of Joseph Campbell's hero journey cycle, which you may have seen from a variety of different sources. It's abundantly illustrated on various internet sites, and I almost see it wrongly presented, incorrectly indicating the direction of the circle, for example, which you'll see here in the original source from the Hero with 1,000 faces. You all actually, as students, might like to feel like the heroes with 1,000 pages, given the reading that you're doing. But at any rate, each reading is a hero journey cycle, moving counterclockwise from which you'll see here in Campbell's vision. And this is important because the movement of the hero, typically for Campbell, moves in a direction that is contrary to the movement of the collective culture and challenges its orientation in critical ways. And this was why the movements in the 60s were called countercultural movements, challenging the basic assumptions of what we used to call the military-industrial complex and all of the tragedies that have gone with it over the years, with an apparently unsuccessful attempt to create some new and some brave new world that avoids those mistakes made in the past. But at any rate, to make this simple, you'll remember that the hero journey cycle involves basically a separation, an initiation, and a return. A call to adventure that can come in a variety of different forms that leads to a departure from a place of relative familiarity, a domestic world, which has been disrupted usually by some kind of problem, either internal or external, that leads the hero or the heroine to go on a journey, crossing a threshold, moving into another world. And in the case of the slide I just showed you, the threshold is the simple crossing of the Nile to the yonder shore, where the river is a basic symbol associated with that process. And that threshold can be accompanied by a wide range of relatively traumatic events that disrupt the basic structures of both the self and the society as the hero moves into the domain of the unknown. Below the threshold of the circle there, you'll see, moving through a series of encounters with trials and ordeals, during the course of which various tests and helpers may appear. And at the bottom of the circle, you'll see the phase of initiation that Campbell refers to as an initiation phase that can happen in a variety of different ways, in a variety of different special sorts of destinations and places, sacred places that I would call a temenos. And the initiation that occurs in this sacred space of the temenos involves fundamentally revelation and transformation. Some fundamental energy or dynamic form is revealed at the heart of the secret of the universe, of the natural world, of the self, of the society. And that profound revelation radically alters, transforms the consciousness of the individual so that a new identity can emerge from the depths of the psyche, if this were in fact a process of individuation in the Jungian world. And the transformation of that consciousness then leads towards the movement towards the return from the sacred space, returning back to the world that one has left, with the difficult challenge of bringing the knowledge of the revelation that has occurred back to the domestic world that one has departed from. And typically this creates some difficulties because the hero is often in a state of alienation. And we're finding it difficult to reincorporate into the society that's been left behind. And the society itself will often be suspicious when the hero or the heroine brings new revelations that challenge the basic structures that it has been organized by. So this process of separation, crossing of the threshold, initiation and return is characteristic of the 1001 variations on the hero journey cycle that Joseph Campbell writes about in his beautiful book, using this particular circle as a model. Now, the journey can go upwards. It can be a celestial ascent, as in the stories of the Prophet Muhammad, or it can go downwards into the underworld, as for example, when Christ descends into hell after the crucifixion. Or the journey can move in a horizontal direction, if this were a Celtic or a Nordic variation of the hero journey cycle, where the movement takes one into another world by sea voyage. And there is not necessarily a sense of an up and a down, but rather a movement directly from one world into the next and a subsequent return. A more complicated image geometrically of this image of the journey is the sine wave curve that I've taken from Northrop Frye's book, The Great Code on the Bible, where he essentially argues that the Bible as a whole, as a book, is structured by a series of narratives modeled on the hero journey cycle of a descent and a return, on a journey of some kind, involving a departure, an experience of revelation and transformation, followed by a return. So that each one of the biblical heroes, for example, of the Old Testament, experiences this kind of a journey, beginning essentially with Adam and Eve, who are cast out of the garden into the exile of their hero journey cycle, only to return in the biblical book of Revelation at the end of the New Testament, when in a return to the garden that was lost was made possible as a result of the sacrifice of Christ and the second coming. But before that, there's a sequence of journeys that occurs. Abraham goes to Mesopotamia, to the city of Ur, and then subsequently returns, makes his way back to his own people in the promised land. Joseph departs from his father's home when he is thrown into the well by his brothers and goes down into Egypt before his subsequent movement towards return and reunion with his family. Jacob, Jonah, sequences of descent and return that move towards a climactic conclusion of the cycle, as I mentioned, with the final heroic journey descent of Christ, both Christ from heaven, incarnating in earthly form and returning, and also the story of Christ's harrowing of hell, going down into hell to liberate the souls of Adam and Eve, and then returning. So this cycle of a series of repetitions of the same basic dynamic of the hero journey cycle of descent and return can be used to structure very large narratives that have multiple hero journey cycles. And this is particularly true in the Bible, but it's also very important in terms of the structure of the narrative of such epic poems as Homer's Odyssey, in which there's a sequence of journeys, or the selections from the Arabian Nights of Sinbad's voyages, which involves a sequence of journeys to another world, followed by a return. So this is the basic narrative structure of descent and return associated with what I call the Nekyia, which is a special word that refers to, generally speaking, the descent to and return from the underworld, as a very special focused example of the way the hero journey circle works. If it goes up to the domain of the heavens, it's a related but different kind of a journey. If, however, the journey goes downwards to the land of the dead, to the realm of the ancestors, into the underworld, we have what I call Nekyia. And there are cultural examples. Every culture practically has such a mythology of the descent to and return from the underworld. And we're going to cover not all of the ones you'll see represented here, but quite a few of them, beginning with Mesopotamia. Now, the underworld is a complicated place. It's not just one thing. Normally, in our culture, when one uses the word underworld, the first associations that occur or come to mind are those of the underworld as hell, as what I would call an inferno, a place of sin and crime and punishment and pain, and most typically associated with Dante's Inferno, where Dante and Virgil go down into hell in the first book of the Divine Comedy. But that's not all there is to the story. The underworld, in fact, can have very different forms with very different kinds of events that occur that are often of a far more positive nature. So that, for example, the underworld typically, in the tradition, is a place where one encounters the ancestral dead, the spirits of the mothers, the spirits of the fathers and the grandfathers, in a kind of ancestral vault or crypt. And most typically, that encounter will lead to the revelation of the hero's destiny, a sense of a fatal encounter. And the revelation of destiny is that myth, essentially, that confers shape and significance and meaning on the life of the individual, so that the whole orientation of one's life and its purpose and its meaning is crucially involved with this recognition of our relationship to our ancestral dead. We can't know who we are until we know from whom we have descended. And this therefore marks significant climactic moments in the Nekyia cycles of Odysseus and Aeneas and Cicero and so forth. Another way of thinking about the special spaces of the underworld is that word I use, temenos, a sacred space, taken from the ancient Greek worlds, where the temenos referred to the healing chambers and temples of Asclepius, or to the theaters or places where athletic events occurred, special spaces of a sacred significance for the culture, which involve the revelation of the divine principles within the self, within the world, within nature, and a radical transformation of the consciousness of the individual and of the culture that occurs as a result. Most often, in the terms of the traditional hero journey, this is a positive moment of radical change and revelation. But as we'll see when we get to modernism at the end of the week, it can also be a negative experience of revelation that does not have a beneficial effect on the individual who's experienced the journey. The vet, for example, that comes back from Iraq and Vietnam, so badly wounded physically and psychologically and spiritually that the individual simply cannot reincorporate into the society left behind. Another positive way of thinking, however, about the underworld, in addition to Inferno, Crypt, and Temenos, is this metaphor that the underworld is a cornucopia, a seed of plenty, where this, as seed forms, the archetypal images are to be encountered. Those formal structures of the imagination that confer shape and significance upon life are typically represented in the journeys to the underworld by characteristic images and a characteristic vocabulary. There is an imagery of the formal structure of the archetypes, of what I might call an iconography of the underworld. And there's also a diction, a language, vocabulary terms relevant to the formal structures of the mind that are revealed at the climactic moment of the descent to and return from the underworld. All of this is by way of trying to break our collective cultural habits that automatically get activated when I use the word underworld. And I'd like you all to think of it as a more complicated kind of a place with many chambers, many rooms within it, one might say. A Mayan underworld might have 5 chambers. An Egyptian underworld would have as many as 12. So it varies from culture to culture. Now, to follow up on this notion that the underworld is not simply a matter of a descent into hell, where one is punished for one's sins for all eternity, but that the descent to the underworld, or the Nekyia, is actually a quite complicated metaphor and allegory for the basic dynamics of creativity, manifested in a variety of different domains of human activity. So that, for example, what we're going to find in our survey of the mythologies is that very often at the climactic moment of the descent, there's the revelation of some secret text, such as the Book of the Dead in the Egyptian judgment scenes, in the Papyrus of Ani, or various books that are referred to in the Epic of Gilgamesh in the Dream of Enkidu, or much, much later in the Romantic period, as we'll see, when the hero of The Mines of Phelan by E.T.A. Hoffmann has a vision of the underworld and a special tablet upon which the destiny and fates of the individuals are being written in a mysterious language, so that the climax of the Nekyia, the descent, involves the revelation of a text that has been mysteriously produced by unknown energies. And that text must then be read and interpreted in the mysterious mysteries of interpretation. So I refer to the mysteries of writing as poesis, the creative energies that produce a text or an image or a song. And I refer to the energies of interpretation or reading activated by the Nekyia as hermeneusis, a process of interpretation, not a completed systematic hermeneutics, but a hermeneusis, a process of reading and interpretation. And quite simply put, every time we read a book, we go into the world of the imagination, into the depths of the psyche, by the mere act of reading, which takes us from one world into another, created by the text, so that it is analogous to that journey. By the same token, when we write a poem or an essay or a novel, we are journeying into an imaginal world of our own creation, so that the Nekyia is a metaphor or analogy for the mysteries of writing and of reading. Now, this creative aspect, of course, of the Nekyia has been perhaps most famously applied by Jung in his notion of the individuation process, the creation of a new identity that I call psychogenesis, where the basic structure of the hero journey cycle is a movement from the unconscious domain of the ego and the persona into the depths of the psyche, where the collective archetypes of the unconscious are activated in the form of dreams and active imagination and fantasy, so that one encounters those deep energies within the self in the underworld of the unconscious and subsequently is transformed by them, so that a new identity can emerge from that process. And this is so important to Jung that I call it Jung's myth of analysis. And I refer to that in a separate but related presentation connected specifically to Jung, where the Nekyia becomes his mythology for the analytical process of individuation. On a larger level, the Nekyia can be seen as a mythology of cosmogenesis, of the creation and destruction of the universe itself. And this is the way Joseph Campbell ends his beautiful book on the hero journey, the hero with 1,000 faces, where there's a notion of the mysterious, spontaneous emergence of the energies of the cosmos to create a universe of forms, solar systems and galaxies and so forth, that last for a certain length of time, depending on the system, a certain number of yugas in the Hindu system, or a certain number of ages in the classical system. But all of those cycles come to an ultimate end as we move, let's say, from Brahma as the creator to Shiva as the destroyer, when the cosmos dissolves into the mysterious darkness from which it has emerged at the end of the cycle, before a new cycle can begin. So that with every breath we take, with every day that passes, with every month and year and lifetime, we emerge from the mysteries of the deep, we experience our brief moment in the sun, and then we return back into the depths from which we've come. And that this is a basic dynamic that replicates the structure of the entire cosmos, from the life of a star to the life of a galaxy and the cosmos itself. So one might simply say that the Nekyia is a simple fact of the natural world, of the descent or return to origins, followed by the creation of a new world for a subsequent cycle. And we'll see some very specific examples of this in the works that we're going to look at. Now, when it comes to vocabulary and that problem that I mentioned of the sometimes unbreakable association that people have when you use the word underworld, associating it with hell or the inferno, I like to think of a variety of terms that work against that, that immediate association. One very simple term is otherworld. The Nekyia, the journey, takes us to some other place, some other domain of the imagination and the spirit, a realm of the archetypes, a realm of the imaginal energies, of the dream, for example. And that movement into the other world may not go up, it might not be celestial ascent, it might not go down, in other words, be a Nekyia. It might move in a more spontaneous horizontal direction, as is typical in the Celtic fairy world, where you step through a hole in the hedge, or you step into the middle of a fairy ring, and suddenly you're transported from one world to the next. Netherworld, of course, suggests the world that is below, but I like this word that I found as the title of a book of poems many years ago, neither world, that the journey is both up and down and neither. It's both sideways, left and right, but neither. It's a movement back and forth somehow between worlds. What Christa Wolf in her great novels, the post-World War II feminist German writer, Christa Wolf, called the counter world, Gegenwelt, gegen meaning against or counter to, in her novels, Clytemnestra and Medea. So that very typically in her books, the underworld is counter to the structures of the upper world. Most typically in her novels, the upper world is associated with the patriarchal energies associated with the catastrophic history of war in the Western world, from the Greek to World War II. Whereas the counter world to which some of the characters escape is a world of the matriarchal domain of the divine feminine, and it offers an alternative vision of possibility that runs counter to the patriarchal world that's produced the catastrophes that we're experiencing today with climate change and political unrest and so forth. James Joyce's word from Finnegan's Wake for this other world is wonder world. Simply put, it would be wonder world, which suggests that the other world is a domain of the imagination. But the way Joyce spells it, wonder world, brings into the pun that he's created the Anglo-Saxon term weird, W-Y-R-D, which means fate, uncanny revelation of one's fate or destiny. And this comes in Finnegan's Wake when he refers to what he calls the overlord of the wonder worlds in a book that is permeated with variations on the Nekyia throughout the course of its many marvelously unintelligible pages. So this is an effort to provide some alternative vocabulary about where we're headed. Now, I'll circle back to some questions or comments about that vocabulary, but I also want to lay the foundation for a kind of historical understanding of where we're going. In the series of presentations in our course on the mythologies of the underworld, and hence I've produced this very, very daunting chronology. which enables me to put pretty much all on one page the foundational materials that we're going to be focusing on in the first session. And these dates that you'll see provide a chronology that incorporates key events in the Mesopotamian world, the Egyptian world, the Greek world, and the biblical world. And it gives you some sense often of the synchronous relationship between what was happening in those cultures at different times, relevant to the study of the mythologies of the Nekyia. So that, for example, the period from about 3500 BC to 1750 BC is a period of great cultural flowering in the Mesopotamian and the Egyptian river valleys, from the Tigris and Euphrates to the Nile, and the emergence of the first great cities and cultures of those domains. And it was these first early cultures that produced our earliest textual versions of the mythologies of the Nekyia, that of course were important to their rituals and architecture and so forth. And we'll begin with the Tigris-Euphrates river valleys, with the Sumerian and the Babylonian cultures, where the oldest text we have is the descent of Inanna, the goddess Inanna's descent to the underworld, in the Sumerian tongue from about 2000 BC. Shortly after that, we have the equally important emergence of the text of the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh, associated with the Babylonian world, and such kings as Hammurabi and the famous law tablets connected to those mythologies, at the same time that the Babylonian creation stories were being created. Now, this is also, of course, the period of the building of the Egyptian tombs, the ancient tombs, and the pyramids, the Valley of the Kings, dating back at least as far as 3500 BC, and then moving forward to 1750 BC, 1500 BC or so, when the famous books of the dead were written down on papyrus tablets that would be buried with the mummy. And those stories from the books of the dead are critically important in understanding the origins and development of the mythologies of the descent to and return from the underworld. Moving just forward from there, of course, we come into the Greek world, beginning with Crete and then on into the Greek mainland. And the mythologies of the labyrinth, particularly in the Minoan period of the culture of Crete, provide us with very, very important foundational stories and images connected to the Minoan versions of the journey to the other world that we'll explore in relationship to the documents and artifacts that have survived. And then from there, of course, we move into the domain of Greek literature proper, and particularly the Homeric epics of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which you'll see here are dated approximately 800 BC, and that suggests a contemporary relationship, temporal at least, not physical and geographical, with the mythologies of the Old Testament, with the earliest versions of the books of the Old Testament in the Bible, which offer critically important variations on the mythologies of the other world that we'll look at with reference to such characters as Joseph and Jesus. So that this process of development can be seen moving from Mesopotamia to Egypt to Greece, and including the developments in the biblical world that we're going to explore as well, focusing on key texts of each one of those different cultural periods. Moving up to dramatic historical events having to do with the collapse of those cultures in the Mesopotamian world, with the collapse and warfare Babylonians and the Assyrians and so forth, and moving forward into the modern era coming out of it. Our critical subject in terms of the mythologies of the descent to the underworld will be what happens after the age of the heroes and the age of the mythologies to the imagery of the Nekyia, or the descent to the underworld. And what happens in Greece, of course, is particularly important here. When we move from what's sometimes called mythos to logos, and the emergence of pre-Socratic philosophers coming before Aristotle and Plato, who develop a new scheme of rational analysis and interpretation that radically transform the understanding of what the mythologies of the Nekyia, of the journey to the underworld, are all about. A process that you might call rationalization, and indeed a kind of secularization of the mythologies that will anticipate what's going to occur when we move into the modern world, with key points of reference for us in the Latin writings of Virgil and Lucretius. So this is a very broad survey of the materials that we'll be covering. I invite you to go back to this page so that you can see these mythologies in relationship to each other. Even though, of course, they're separated geographically, there are often important connections between the cultures, such as those between Egypt and Greece and Rome, for example. So to conclude the introductory conversation, I want to say something about what I had mentioned earlier, that there is a certain iconography associated with the mythology of the other world. And by iconography, I'm referring to images characteristically evoked in texts and in paintings that evoke the journey to the other world. And I have coined a special term for those special images activated by the descent to the underworld by combining the words Nekyia and archetype to yield a neologism, necrotype. By necrotype, I simply mean universal archetypal images that are associated with the myth of the journey to the world of the dead, using the root NEK or NEC, which relates to death and decomposition, as in the word necropolis or necrotic, and with the purpose of suggesting that we'll find certain typical images associated with the Nekyia right from the very beginning in the Mesopotamian cultures that will last us all the way through the whole history of Western civilization, up into the period of postmodern literature and film. And I've provided a special vocabulary for those characteristic necrotypes or images that are evoked by the journey. And I had quite some fun coining these words, some of them familiar to you. Ornithological clearly relates to bird symbols of the underworld. Astronomical, cycles of the sun, the moon, planet Venus, and the constellations. Zoomorphic, certain animals are associated with the journey, whether it be the horse or the dog. Characteristic insects, the bee and the butterfly. Aquatic imagery of the crossing of rivers and seas to the underworld, so forth. Oreographic refers to mountains, and the mountains as the temenos or destination of journeys to the underworld comes up right away from the beginning with the Epic of Gilgamesh and the mythology of the Egyptian books of the dead. And then more abstract kinds of symbols associated with clothing, taking clothing off, divestiture, for example, and to be replaced by a special kind of clothing. Clothing symbolism goes all the way through this. So does architectural symbolism, doorways, windows, staircases, and so forth. So that I want to explore these images to see how consistent they are throughout the course of the traditional handlings of the mythologies of the Nekyia. Of all of those images, I have a special fascination with images that I called hologlyphs. And here again, I've combined two words, hieroglyph and holograph. Hieroglyph, more familiar, refers to a kind of visual language of symbols taken from the natural world that have a spiritual significance, as in the Egyptian hieroglyphics. Holograph refers to a special kind of photography associated with the Star Wars series, for example, when the image of Princess Leia comes out of the little robot R2-D2. It's a three-dimensional image. And the way holographic photography works is that the whole image is encoded into each part of the holographic plate. So that if you have, imaginally, a holographic plate that you cut in half and you develop it metaphorically, you get the whole image in every part. Unlike a traditional negative photograph, where if you cut the negative in half and develop it, you only get half of the image. In a holograph, the whole image is in every little part. The world is in a grain of sand, is the way that William Blake put it. And again, I've got a whole separate presentation on the notion of hieroglyphs and holographs. But for our purposes, by the word hologlyph, I'm referring to a single image, one image, that combines the opposites of the whole system of the entire created world. And one example would be the Star of David, or the Seal of Solomon, the image of the interlocking equilateral triangles, one pointed up, the other pointed downwards, interlocking with each other. And they combine the opposites. The downward pointed triangle is the female triangle of incarnation, moving from the spirit into the flesh. And the upward pointed triangle is the triangle of transfiguration, moving from the flesh to the spirit, and is typically associated with the male and death and transfiguration of the spirit. So if you combine the two, you've got the images of the male and the female, masculine and the feminine, and the images of birth and death combined in a single image. And typically the Seal of Solomon with the equilateral triangles is set in the middle of a circle, suggesting that this is a hero journey cycle of descent and return, and that the Seal of Solomon is a hologlyphic image that embraces the opposites of the whole cosmos in a single image. And it's those kinds of images that are most characteristically associated with the profound revelations of the Nekyia, or the descent to the underworld. And many years ago, I had a good friend in Texas who provided this diagram for me that I used in my book on the postmodernist variations of the journey to the other world. And it shows us the many, many different imagistic forms that are activated by the Nekyia that you'll see in the center of these octagons to form a mandala, with the zoomorphic and the insectomorphic images in the purple upper right, the images from the natural world on the upper left, and then complicated images of eyes and divestiture and doorways, architectural motifs in the lower left, and then different vocabulary words from an archetypal diction of the Nekyia, different words that are associated with the revelation of those archetypal forms that are triggered by the language in the text in its process of descent and return. So as we explore the various variations on the Nekyia, beginning in the first session with Mesopotamia, I'd like you to hold this in mind when I refer to the necrotypal images in the text. I'm referring back to this introductory material. And we are going to turn now to the mythologies of the Mesopotamian world, and which we will come back to after a break in the next session, or when you're able to watch these. And again, please return to the sessions or communicate with me via email or D2L postings with some questions and observations about this sequence of lectures that I'm providing, focusing on our theme of the journey to and return from the underworld. So have a good break, and we'll see you back for the second round of presentations focusing on Mesopotamia.